Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Bledsoe. I'm a strategic advisor at the Progressive Policy Institute, and you're joining a short webinar on reducing the European Union reliance on Russian natural gas. I'm going to wait 1 minute to let a few of your colleagues join, but then we'll get started. Just so you know, I try to do this very quickly. I know your time is precious. I think it'll take me about 20 minutes to go through the slide deck. I think there are only about 13 slides. And then there is a Q&A function in the webinar. If you want to submit questions, we can try to get to those at the end. All right, why don't we get started? So I wrote a report for PPI, which we released in December, examining the decades of EU reliance on Russian natural gas. And what we see is its huge geopolitical, military, security, and including climate change costs. The EU gets about 40% of its total gas from Russia, 60% of its imports. And this is having a malign impact on a whole host of, as I say, geopolitical, security, military, energy, and climate issues. Everybody is pretty familiar at this point, as Vladimir Putin threatens to invade Ukraine, with the geopolitical nightmare. It's worth noting that the Kremlin gets about a third of its total revenue, some sources say even more than that, directly from its oil and gas exports. And in fact, oil and gas and mining make up 60% of Russia's total export revenue. And this money is used by the Kremlin not only to repress domestic political opposition, but obviously to undermine elections, including our own and those in Europe, as well as using gas as a geopolitical weapon against Europe. And it's worth noting that independent experts have found that Putin has restricted exports of Russian gas during this cold winter in Europe of high prices as part of a strategy to force Europe to accept the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Less obvious is the climate disaster that's presented from Russian gas, which is a big focus of our report. Russia is the largest emitter in the world of methane, which is a super climate pollutant, 80 times more powerful than CO2. And increasingly, methane is the focus of US and EU and global climate mitigation. And yet here is Russia with the worst methane emissions in the world. And in fact, the Gazprom, the Russian monopoly on its gas production, has a leaky, antiquated natural gas production system, which has 8 times the methane fugitive emission leaks as European domestic gas. Overall, we believe that methane leaks are at least 5 to 7%, probably much higher actually, of total volume of Russian gas, which makes Russian gas worse than coal from a climate perspective. And in fact, obviously, gas is partly meant to replace domestic EU coal on climate grounds, and yet the leaks of methane from Russian gas are so high that it's actually worse than coal. And the Europeans are in real denial about this problem. And so one of the things I hope we can do is for the US to work with Europe to recognize this problem. By comparison, the US has focused for decades on reducing methane emissions from oil and gas. And in our study, we examined 6 analyses of US gas and its methane emissions And the average of these studies, it's about a 1 to 2% leakage rate of fugitive emissions from the American gas system. So we have much lower methane emissions, and they're going to be far lower going forward as new regulations and industry action takes place. So our report suggests that there's a need for a long-term joint US-EU strategy to limit the geopolitical and climate risks and costs of Russian gas. The EU is the world's largest gas importer by far today, although Asian imports are catching up, and I'll mention that more a little later. The US is a growing exporter of natural gas as liquefied natural gas. And in fact, US LNG exports were the largest in the world just last month. So we believe that together, the US and the EU can come up with a strategy to cut reliance on Russian gas and in fact, eventually create a market for low methane gas, which will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So as I mentioned, the US has focused on limiting methane from our own oil and gas development. President Biden in November announced very stringent new domestic regulations on new and existing oil and gas wells. There's $16 billion for mitigating emissions from old wells and mines in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And these efforts are already opening up the EU to greater US LNG imports even before the current crisis. Our view is, however, there's a broader opportunity for the US and EU to harmonize their regulatory policies such that lower methane LNG exports from the US gain a larger market share. And I'll talk more about those details later. The rest of the world, in contrast, doesn't have, not only do they not regulate methane emissions, they have no accurate accounting of the fugitive emissions of methane. This is entirely true in Russia. Investigative series by the Washington Post found that Russia has deliberately hidden their massive methane emissions, fugitive emissions from their leaky gas system for decades. But this is also true of Iran, who is a major natural gas producer, and Qatar too, who is an ally of ours, but it's unclear that their data is trustworthy. So there's a need globally to force natural gas producers to do what we do, which is provide accurate data about methane emissions and then drive those emissions down over time. The good news is that up until the last few years, we didn't have the technologies to detect methane emissions in places like Russia, and now we do. There are new satellite technologies that allow us to increasingly isolate specific huge events of flaring and in fact venting of gas in Russia. There was several reports on this last year, including the Washington Post study. So we now know definitively that Russia is the biggest methane culprit in the world, but we also know Iran has problems, and these technologies are going to be increasingly deployed, so we'll be able to catch them in the act of these methane emissions. As I mentioned, the administration is increasingly recognizing the role of US LNG exports during the current crisis, but I think also as a long-term strategy. The president mentioned just last week in his press conference that there was a role for natural gas, US natural gas, to take the burden off European countries that are dependent on Russia. We know there's reporting just today in the Washington Post and elsewhere that the US is looking at reaching out to allies to increase their LNG exports to Europe should Putin invade and Russian gas be cut off. It's worth noting that US LNG exports are increasing It's a big investment by Cheniere in an LNG facility that's going to increase LNG exports in 2022. And that the Biden administration has rejected calls to ban exports. I think that is now finally off the table, that we're going to be exporting LNG for a long time to Europe, given the problems with Russia. It is worth noting that we got very positive response from the administration, senior officials at DOE and elsewhere, to the report generally and its major themes. The U.S. Oil and gas industry is also really beginning to reduce its emissions of methane after a long time of being in denial about it. I think that it's notable, for example, that the head of API came out just last week and said that they're willing to work with the Biden administration on methane regulations. I think that was a very important announcement. But individual companies are suddenly making very large investments, in part because plugging methane leaks can be done at almost zero cost, at least half of them, because then you have more natural gas. And so studies have found that 70% of methane can be captured with existing technologies. And I think the oil and gas industry in the United States, and increasingly, I think globally, recognizes that cutting methane will be necessary for gas to compete in an increasingly climate-constrained energy system. However, gas is going to be needed for decades, both here in the United States and in Europe. It's worth noting that natural gas is very synchronistic with renewable energy because combined cycle new natural gas plants, you can press a button and they're online within a few minutes. So when the wind drops and the sun stops shining, gas can come right online. That's not true of nuclear, and it's not even true of coal. So gas has this compatibility with renewable energy in the energy transition. And as we drive down methane emissions, I think gas is going to be the key non-renewable fuel in the US, Europe, and elsewhere for a long time to come. It's also worth noting that I believe, more on this a bit later, that natural gas is going to be the best way to supplant global coal emissions. Europe still gets 15% of its electricity from coal. Obviously, the US still gets more than that, or probably over 20% still from coal. And then globally, you have places like China that get about 70% of their electricity from coal. So there's a role for natural gas to displace higher emitting coal and be synchronistic with renewable energy. I think the real question is, will the US and Europe use natural gas strategically to address these security, energy, economic, and climate challenges and opportunities? So that's what our report is really about. And in fact, the one on the EU and Russia is just one in a series of reports urging the US to think about our natural gas supplies strategically to meet our climate, energy, and security goals. So the EU is finally beginning to take some action to cut methane leaks from natural gas. There's a draft bill that would require reductions for domestic sources of EU gas, but because they're so reliant on imports, to truly limit methane emissions, the EU, as the world's largest gas importer, has to regulate imports. So I believe the US should urge the EU over time to limit, to require that all gas imports have low methane emissions and be able to approve it. There's also obviously a very important role in renewable energy and other sources of clean energy, energy storage in Europe to limit the use of Russian gas. So we need to increase renewable and clean energy along with gas to displace Russian gas. And we have to help the Ukrainians develop their gas capacity, but make sure that that gas is lower emitting as well. So here are the policy recommendations in the report. The overall one is that we need accurate reporting of methane emissions from all gas imports into the EU, and that eventually the EU should regulate gas imports based on methane emissions. That will force exporters of natural gas like Russia have huge emissions to clean up their acts and stop, this massive greenhouse gas emissions from their gas capacity. But we also need the EU and with the US help to increase renewable energy and electricity storage capacity. We should be, I believe, increasing liquefied natural gas exports from the US to Europe, including granting new LNG export facilities here and encouraging more LNG import facilities in Europe. I think we need to help Ukraine modernize their gas system. I think we need to, at least for the foreseeable future, prevent the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from becoming operational. Once that happens, Europe is locked into Russian gas for a long time. It will increase the leverage of Russia over the European natural gas supply. There's deep division in Germany about this, but the EU is increasingly wary. I think this crisis may push approval of Nord Stream 2 out much farther to the future and give us time to implement a broader strategy. And then importantly, I think this work on natural gas in the EU, US, and globally can lay the groundwork for a long-term hydrogen power strategy, which uses both renewable energy and gas to produce hydrogen. The hydrogen can use the same infrastructure and distribution system that gas now uses. So a long-term investment in gas transitioning to hydrogen is a long-term investment, not a stranded investment. As I mentioned, the report on EU and Russian gas is one in a series that PPI has produced. We did a report on the role of natural gas in US climate and energy goals. In December 2020, we did the EU report last month, and we have two reports coming out later this year. The first will look at the role of natural gas in cutting greenhouse gas emissions from Asia, and particularly reducing Chinese coal emissions. I think natural gas, low methane natural gas, non-leaky natural gas has an ability to reduce global emissions, particularly from Chinese coal. And then our final report will be, in this series anyway, will be on the role of hydrogen and natural gas together to reduce long-term greenhouse gas emissions, and how we see hydrogen increasingly playing a role with natural gas and eventually supplanting natural gas so that we can meet the zero emissions goal by 2050 as the Paris Agreement and climate science calls for. More broadly, I really feel like the Democratic Party needs to embrace the strategic opportunities of natural gas to meet our climate, security, and economic goals. I think there's been a reluctance to do that, but I think this crisis in Ukraine and Russia and this longer term problem with Europe's addiction to Russian gas present an opportunity to do that. I've gotten a couple of questions that I can hopefully address now. We will share the slides with you so that you can take these back to your colleagues and your bosses. And we're also definitely available to provide individual briefings to members and committees if that is of interest. We're already talking to, I believe, the House Foreign Relations Committee next week on these topics. Got another question asking about the new German Chancellor Scholz and his views toward Nord Stream 2. The new German government is divided. The Chancellor is warily pro Nord Stream 2, but the Green Party and others in his coalition are against it. I actually think that the crisis with Ukraine is going to reduce the chances that Germany approves the Nord Stream 2 pipeline anytime soon. And I also think there's an opportunity for Brussels and the EU to prevent the accreditation and of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So I think this crisis is sort of opening the eyes of the Germans to the real costs of their deep reliance and Europe's deep reliance on Russian natural gas. So thanks again for your time. I hope that that you can reach out. I've got one more question. This is a very good one. It asks, what kind of data sources are being used to determine the methane intensity of Russian production? So as I said, the Russians have hidden their methane emissions for decades. There are 2 or 3 sources I used in the report, which is where I got the 5 to 7% methane emissions from Russian gas. Other sources say that the Russian gas emissions are far higher. The detection technologies, satellite detection technologies, are the ones that now show that Russia has massive methane emissions. These were cited in the Washington Post reporting in November. So we are just now learning the true scope of Russian methane emissions through these new satellite detection technologies. But it's clear that Russian methane emissions are extremely high, and the US is pushing down our methane emissions to not only much lower than previously, but the lowest in the world. And that gap between low US methane emissions from natural gas and high Russian emissions, I believe, should drive Europe as a matter of climate policy, as well as geopolitical and security policy, to limit Russian natural gas imports based on methane emissions. I think there's a real opportunity there. The question also asks how these methane emissions happen. They happen in 2 or 3 ways. The primary way is that they just allow the gas well to vent, right? They don't even connect the gas well to the pipeline system. The second way is that the drilling and the transportation is very leaky. They're very old equipment and infrastructure that hasn't been in Russia, that hasn't been updated in decades. And then the third way is the flaring of gas that we have seen traditionally in the United States, and which the companies and the Biden administration is really clamping down on now. So those are the ways that these fugitive emissions of natural gas become the super pollutant methane. So we have the technologies to stop these methane emissions here in the US and globally, and it's a very important part of global climate mitigation. Methane is the second most important greenhouse gas after CO2. It accounts for about 20 to 25% of all global warming. So this is crucial climate policy as well as security policy. Right, a final question asked if the detection technology will uncover higher emissions in Russia than 5 to 7%. The answer is almost certainly yes. That's what the initial data is showing. So Russia is just a methane bomb, their system, and which is why it's a climate as well as a security imperative. Well, thanks again for your time, and please do reach out individually to us if we can set up additional briefings. Appreciate your time in this busy period. Thanks so much.